I call the Lord Chancellor, Shabana Mahmood.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. With your permission, I would like to make a statement on how this government will address the crisis in our prisons, not just today, but for years to come. This House has heard me recount my inheritance as Lord Chancellor before. The crisis in our prisons was, I believe, the greatest disgrace of the last Conservative government. They left our prisons on the point of collapse, a situation that would have forced us to close the prison doors, cancel all trials and force the police to halt their arrests. Crime would have gone unpunished, victims would never have seen justice done, and we would have witnessed the total breakdown of law and order. The former Prime Minister knew he had to act. His Lord Chancellor begged him to do so, but instead he called an election. As I announced to this House on the 18th of July, we had no choice but to bring forward the release point for some prisoners. Some of those serving standard determinate sentences have seen the custodial element reduced from 50% to 40%, spending the rest of their sentence on licence, where they can be recalled to prison should probation staff judge that necessary to protect the public. As we saw over the summer of disorder, these releases could not have come soon enough. After the August bank holiday, we were left with fewer than 100 spaces in our men's prisons. The system was only held together by the heroic work and considerable goodwill of our prisons and probation staff. And we were, on many occasions, just one bad day from disaster. Today, the second tranche of emergency releases takes place, creating desperately needed space within our prisons. But this is not the long-term solution. So I will now set out the long-term plan for our prisons, a plan that will ensure that never again is a Lord Chancellor placed in the invidious position that I was on taking office. This must begin by building more prisons. For all their rhetoric, the last Conservative government's record on prison building was abject. They like to mention that between 2010 and 2024, they built 13,000 places. What they are less keen to admit is that in that same time, they closed 12,500. In 14 years, they added just 500 places to our prison capacity. In just our first 100 days, this government is already close to matching that. And while the last government promised to build 20,000 new places by the mid-2020s, by the time they left office, they had built only 6,000. They were simply too terrified of their own backbenchers, who supported prison building vociferously as long as those prisons weren't getting built anywhere near them. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government will build the prisons the last Conservative government promised but failed to deliver. But in seeking a lasting solution to our prisons crisis, we must be honest too, in a way that my predecessors were not. We cannot build our way out of this problem. Every year, our prison population grows by around 4,500 prisoners. This is a question of simple mathematics. To build enough prisons to meet this demand, we would have to build the equivalent of HMP Birmingham, in my own constituency of Birmingham, Ladywood, 4.5 times over every single year. To put that in some context, in the last 10 years, the last Conservative government built just 3 prisons. So while we will speed up prison building and build as fast as we possibly can, that pace is simply impossible. For that reason, Madam Deputy Speaker, if we are to address our prisons crisis, we must be smarter about who receives a prison sentence. Now, let me be clear. There will always be a place for prison, and there will always be offenders who must be locked up. But we must also expand the range of punishments that we use outside of prison and consider how we punish those offenders who have broken our rules but are not a danger to society. For that reason, I am today launching a review of sentencing, and it will have one clear goal: to ensure that we are never again in a position where we have more prisoners than we have space in our prisons. The review will follow 3 principles. First, sentences must punish offenders and protect the public. For dangerous offenders, prison will always remain the answer. Punishment and public protection will be this government's first priority. There will also be some offenders who I will task the review with considering, like prolific offenders, who are just 1 in every 10 individuals, but nearly half of all sentences. Some of these are hyper-prolific offenders committing hundreds of crimes, and I will ask the reviewers to consider whether a longer sentence might punish them better and force them to engage with rehabilitation on the inside. The second related principle of the review is that sentences must encourage offenders to turn their backs on crime. We need both sticks and carrots. In this, I will be encouraging the reviewers to learn from others who have succeeded. In Texas, for instance, Republican legislators were faced by a problem similar to ours: a soaring prison population, sky-high reoffending rates, and prisons that had run out of space. Working across political divides, the Texans introduced a system of good behaviour credits, where well-behaved prisoners could earn time off their sentence by engaging in rehabilitation programmes. And the results were remarkable. Crime fell by nearly a third, reaching the lowest levels in half a century. The prison population fell by over 20,000, and after 2 decades, the Texans had closed 16 prisons rather than building new ones. The third principle of the review is that it must expand the punishment that offenders receive outside of prison. There are already ways that we severely constrain offenders, limiting their freedom outside of prison. Those under home detention curfews are, in practice, under a form of house arrest. With a tag on their ankle and a sensor in their home, they are placed under curfews, generally for 12 hours each day. And should they break that curfew, they can be picked up and, if needs be, locked up. In some ways, punishment outside of prison can be even more restrictive than prison. It is a sad fact that in many of our prisons today, a drinker can all too easily procure a drink. On a sobriety tag, however, with their sweat measured every 30 minutes and a 97% compliance rate, their teetotalism is almost as strict as mine. All of this is just using the technology that is immediately available to us and used already in this country. I will be inviting the reviewers to consider the technology that they have available to them now, and also the next frontier of technology used in other countries but not yet in ours. Because I believe that the modern world presents us with the opportunity to build a prison outside of prison, where the eyes of the state follow a prisoner more closely than any prison officer can. Moving punishment out of prison for those who can be safely managed there has huge benefits. Outside of prison, offenders can engage in work that pays back communities and individuals who they have harmed. And the evidence is abundantly clear that those who serve their sentences outside of prison are far less likely to reoffend, cutting crime with fewer victims and safer streets, and reducing the huge cost to society of reoffending, most recently valued at over £22 billion a year. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government believes that crime must have consequences and criminals must be punished. It also believes in rehabilitation, that those who earn the right must be encouraged to turn their backs on crime. This government believes in prison, but we must also increase the use of punishment outside of prison too. And this sentencing review will be tasked with pursuing these goals. It will be led, I am pleased to say, by a former Lord Chancellor, David Gauke, a highly regarded minister who served in multiple roles across government, who has rightly gained the respect of both the judiciary and the legal sector, as well as many within this House. And I will work with him to assemble a panel of reviewers who will draw together deep expertise and experience in the criminal justice system. This review will take a bipartisan and evidence-based look at an issue that has, for far too long, been a political football booted around by both sides. David Gauke will report back with his recommendations in the spring, and I have placed a copy of the complete terms of reference of the review in the library of the House. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is right that the review is given time to do its work. But as I have noted already, the capacity crisis in our prisons has not gone away. When we introduced emergency measures, we believed that they had brought us around a year. However, after the summer of disorder, the next crisis could be just 9 months away. For that reason, I announced last week an extension of magistrates' court sentencing powers, which allows us to bear down on the remand population in our prisons. But we must go further. And while I will not countenance any further emergency releases of prisoners, there are operational measures that I will lay before the House in the months ahead. The first, which I've already referenced, is home detention curfew. This modern form of house arrest curtails freedom and helps offenders turn their lives around. Offenders are subject to electronically monitored curfews, which must be imposed for 9 hours a day, are generally 12 hours long, and can in fact extend to 16 hours. As the Shadow Lord Chancellor himself noted in this House in February of this year, the reoffending rate for the average prisoner, when measured a few years ago, is close to 50%, but for offenders released on a home detention curfew, it is 23%. This government will soon extend the use of this measure, following in the footsteps of the last administration, who expanded its use rightly on a number of occasions. We will increase the maximum period eligible offenders can spend under house arrest from 6 months to 12 months. The second measure that we will introduce will address the soaring recall population, which has doubled from 6,000 to 12,000 in just 6 years. Risk-assessed recall review is a power of the Secretary of State to re-release on licence those who pose a low risk to the public, avoiding the long waits that they often face for a parole board hearing. In the past, this measure was used often. Between 2017 and 2019, it was used between 1,000 and 1,500 times each year. In recent years, its use has fallen to as low as 92 times in 2022. Later this month, I intend to review the risk-assessed recall review process so that lower-risk cases can be considered for re-release after they have been recalled to prison for 2 to 3 months, where their further detention is no longer necessary to protect the public. And I should note that this will only change the cases that can be considered for release, with the final decision still in the hands of experienced probation officers and managers. The final area where I intend to make progress is in the case of foreign national offenders. I share the public's view that with 10,000 in our prisons, there are far too many foreign offenders in this country, costing £50,000 a year each to house at His Majesty's pleasure. It happens to be my personal view that deportation is as good a punishment as imprisonment, if not better. We are currently on track to remove more foreign national offenders this year than at any time in recent years. But I will now be working with my colleagues across government to explore the ways that we can accelerate this further, including working with the Home Office to make the early removal scheme for foreign offenders more effective. Madam Deputy Speaker, when I walked into the Ministry of Justice for the first time as Lord Chancellor just over 3 months ago, I encountered a prison system on the brink of collapse. This was the result of the inaction of the last government, who thought they could dither and delay and led us to the precipice of disaster. But their failure was actually longer in the making. They failed to build the prison places that this country needs, and they failed to address the challenge of an ever-rising prison population. In July, this government took action to avert the immediate disaster. But the plan that I have set out today does more than that. It will ensure that this government and its successors are never forced to rely on the emergency release of prisoners again, a measure over which I had no choice, that I took despite my personal beliefs, and that must never happen again. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Minister Ed Argar.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And as always, I'm grateful to the Lord Chancellor for early sight of her statement and for coming to the House, indeed, to deliver it as an oral statement to give us the opportunity to ask questions. She is always unfailingly courteous in her dealings with this House. Now, the Lord Chancellor made a number of announcements today. In respect of her sentencing review, it is important that we see the detail of this and that whatever the outcome, it ensures that victims' voices are heard throughout, that the worst offenders, violent or sexual offenders, for example, stay behind bars for longer, that, as she alluded to, prolific offenders who cause so much blight and harm can still be subject to a custodial sentence where appropriate. Now, we've seen reoffending overall fall since 2010 under the last government from around 31% to just over 25%, but there is, of course, still more to do. And it's right that we look at all sentences, including tough community sentences, through the prism of what reduces reoffending and boosts rehabilitation and what best protects the public. Now, with that in mind, I know David Gauke well. He was my first boss as a minister. He is a decent, honourable, able and thoughtful man, and I regard him as a friend, so I won't prejudge what he will conclude in his review today. But we will rightly, as she would expect, scrutinise it when it's published and hold the government to account for the choices they make on how to proceed subsequently to that. I hope its terms of reference might also be able to include not just male prisoners but also female prisoners and female offenders as well, building on the female offender strategy that in fact David Gork and I put in place many years ago. Now, in respect of prison capacity, as the Right Honourable Lady sets out, prison capacity has been under significant pressure for some time, and while the situation was incredibly acute in 2008, 2009 and 2010, it remains a very significant challenge. This is due to increased average sentence length for first offenders, which we make no apology for, matched by the biggest prison building programme since the Victorian era, with thousands of additional places built, while tackling the legacy of crumbling prison estate we inherited in 2010, and the party opposite's absolute failure to build the 7,500 tightened prison places they promised in government. But of course, the pandemic decisions not to mass release and the impact of rightly retaining jury trials and the effect these had on the remand population, compounded by the bar strike, undoubtedly significantly increased pressure despite our prison building programme. Now, the Lord Chancellor has set out her chosen approach, with more convicted criminals released at the 40% rather than 50% point of their sentence today in tranche 2 of SDS 40. On that, we are seeing very significant levels of concern from victims of crime, and we saw a very powerful package on Sky News this morning highlighting this. So there are a number of important questions I have on that aspect for the Lord Chancellor. She said she'll publish data on SDS 40 in the coming weeks in the normal run of statistics. I understand that, but would be grateful if she could provide the date that will be published. On media this morning, she alluded to recalls being very high, but disputed they were as high as 50%, as suggested on Radio 4, based on her internal data. Can she enlarge on what that rate actually looks like? In response to a written question from me, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State sitting next to her acknowledged hotels are now being used in some cases to accommodate released prisoners under SDS 40. In light of her commitment at oral questions last month to be transparent about this, although it took a written question from me to get the confirmation, how many hotel rooms or places are being used and at what cost? We've heard little thus far about deporting FNOs, so I'm very pleased to see her focusing on that in her remarks today. When will she set out more details of her plans to improve the deportation rate of FNOs, and what targets is she setting for that? Does she now acknowledge that, contrary to the government's claims that domestic abuse and domestic violence offences would be excluded, as we pointed out at the time and as victims pointed out, this is simply not the case? As DA offenders committing ABH or GBH are not excluded, will she revisit the exclusions list to review this? Will she commit to building more prisons over and above the new prisons we funded, we've already completed or are being built, over and above those 6, and will she commit to funding additional prison building above that? This again, now, turning to HDC, this again will further reduce the time spent behind bars by convicted criminals. Potentially, if, for example, someone with a 4-year sentence not excluded from SDS 40, they'd now be out at just around 19 months. Then, with the possibility now of 12-month HDC, that could mean they were only just over 6 months inside for a 4-year sentence. Now, I recognise the interaction between different schemes and different calculations is complex and may be different in individual cases, but can she reassure the House a fixed minimum percentage will always be served by those sentenced to prison? Now, she'll appreciate that with layer and layer of reductions, some people will struggle to see the punishment or public protection being to the fore at the moment. So can she clarify a number of further points? While most DA offences would be presumed ineligible for HDC, this is not absolute, and again, many common DA offences like ABH or common assault aren't presumed ineligible. So what will she do to address that? Does she intend to examine both schemes, SDS 40 and this, in terms of the list of exclusions and come back to the House with a tougher list? Tagging is a vital part of HDC, but while there may be the tags, as she mentioned this morning, at present it appears the ability to fit them swiftly is sadly lacking. What reassurances can she give that there is now no backlog at all in tagging? What steps is she taking to ensure victims are contacted when perpetrators are released, and what additional resource is going into victim support services and probation over and above what we had already previously committed to. And finally, on Ra, it's right that experienced staff judge these cases. The smaller numbers, she will know, reflect both risk assessment but also the complex interaction of Ra with other release schemes, and therefore the bounty she may expect to get from this will be very limited, I fear. Will she confirm details in due course to the House of the proposed changes she intends to make? And finally, and most importantly, as I pressed her last week, it is vital the criminal justice system is not subject to a flat budget or worse, cuts in next week's budget, which would let down victims, those who work in the system and the public. I fully appreciate she will not be able to prejudge that budget either at the dispatch box or in the media. But a fair financial settlement alongside her setting out her long-term plans for the system, and I acknowledge a little of which we've seen today, will be absolutely essential if victims and the public are to have confidence in her government on law and order.
Lord Chancellor.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Shadow Lord Chancellor for the way in which, the courteous way in which he has approached this debate and for his detailed questions. Let me start with his points in relation to the sentencing review. The voice of victims will be heard. There will be a representative with experience of working with victims to make sure that that is covered in the review, and I look forward to announcing further members of that review panel over the coming days. The review will be free to consider every aspect of the sentencing framework. That includes the use of whole life orders, minimum sentences. We've not constrained the sentencing review in any way. They should take a proper look at the sentencing framework that we have and go where the evidence takes them. I do acknowledge the progress that was made on reducing reoffending, but as the Shadow Lord Chancellor also accepts there is much more to do. We know that 80% of all offenders are in fact reoffenders. We know that 90% of those sentenced to custody are reoffenders. We have a big problem with that revolving door in and out of our prisons, and that is something that as a country I think is a significant challenge that we have to overcome. I will be placing the terms of reference, as I said, in the library of the House. He'll be pleased to see it does refer to cohorts of offenders, so that includes female offenders as well. He will also know, I think, in my conference speech in September, I laid out a different approach to how we, I know he followed it closely, we're setting out a different approach to how this government deals with women in our prisons, and I'm setting up a Women's Justice Board who will report with a strategy in the spring. I do think that we need to do more with female offenders, especially given the impacts that incarceration of women has on their children and the breaking up of family homes, particularly where two-thirds are actually in prison for non-violent offences. I hope there is cross-party consensus on dealing with women offenders differently in this House. On prison capacity, I will say gently to the Shadow Lord Chancellor, we can trade numbers across this dispatch box about things the last government, Labour government, did before 2010, or he might want to acknowledge the failure that took place over his government's 14 years in power. He knows that only 500 prison places net were added by his government over 14 years, and that the crisis that faced me when I walked into the department, especially as you know, as having just walked out of that same department only a few days before, was acute. The previous government ran our prisons boiling hot for far too long, meaning by the time I took over, the inheritance I received from the previous government was dire, and it left me with no option other than to do the emergency release of prisoners. I will also say to him, I note the points he makes in relation to domestic abuse cases and domestic violence. I would remind him of his own early release scheme that his government implemented for many months before the last general election, the so-called end of custody supervised licence scheme. It had none of the exclusions that the SDS 40 scheme has. He knows that. He knows we pulled every lever available to us within the law to exclude offences that are most closely connected to domestic abuse and domestic violence. He will also know that as a matter of law it is only possible to exclude offence types rather than offenders. But I've had to pull this emergency lever. I've sought to do so in the safest way possible possible, to make as many exclusions as are possible, and also to give the probation service the time they need to prepare for this measure and to make sure that victims are notified under victim notification schemes in the usual way. I will be publishing the data in relation to Tranche 1 and Tranche 2 releases in 2 ad hoc statistical releases before Christmas, so that data will be in the public domain. The recall rate, he will know from his own time in the department, usually hovers between 6 and 10%. It can vary quite a bit between those numbers. Our current information is that the SDS 40 releases are not showing a higher recall rate than you would expect compared to normal releases, but of course those statistics will be published in the usual way in due course. On hotels, I made provision to allow the emergency use of hotel accommodation for prisoners being released under the SDS 40 scheme to prevent any homelessness that might lead to higher rates of recall. Fewer than 20 prisoners have been housed in hotels, so it's fewer than 20 at very, very low cost. This is a temporary measure, and I don't anticipate it will be used any more extensively than it has been already. On foreign national offenders, I will return to this House. That work is underway across government, and I'm working closely with my colleagues in the Home Office. And then just on HDC, I will be publishing for the House and will return to the House with the detail of the further measures on home detention curfew. He rightly says not everybody is automatically eligible for a home detention curfew. There is still a risk assessment that takes place, and safeguarding concerns are the number one way in which domestic abuse issues show up as a red flag for a particular prisoner. And I wouldn't imagine that those previous and current arrangements would change very much with the measures that we will take. On Serco, I thank him for the contract concluded with Serco to deliver the tagging. It might not have been him directly and personally, but it was from his government. The performance of Serco has been unacceptable. Let me be very clear with the House. There is no shortage of tags in this country. They have failed to make sure that they've got enough staff in place to tag everybody that needs a tag. Their progress has been monitored daily by myself, my ministers and officials in the department. We will continue to hold their feet to the fire. We will levy financial penalties, and all options remain on the table. Performance has improved a little. They have made progress, but all options are on the table if that falls back in any way. He will know I am not going to comment on anything relating to the budget. The Chancellor will make her statement in due course. I would gently remind him that the budgets of the Ministry of Justice under the Tory party left a lot to be desired.
The Chair of the Justice Select Committee, Andrew Slaughter.
Madam Deputy Speaker, may I welcome the approach the Lord Chancellor is taking to management of the prison system and the appointment of David Gauke to head the sentencing review. Given the initiatives she's announced today to relieve pressure on prisons will create additional work for already overstretched probation officers, will she make a further statement when she has decided what operational changes she is making to the probation service? The additional 14,000 prison places she's promised to build will take prison capacity to above 100,000. Is that desirable in the long term? Given her intention to expand punishment outside prison, will she make it her aim in time to close some of the worst of our existing prisons, built 2 or 3 centuries ago, which warehouse crime and, despite the best efforts of prison staff, do little or nothing to reform or rehabilitate their inmates?
Chancellor.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Chair of the Select Committee for his questions. On probation, look, I recognise the workload, the very high workloads that probation officers are working under. We committed in our manifesto to a strategic review of probation governance. I've made sure that we brought forward the recruitment of an extra 1,000 probation officers by March of next year, and we are working closely with probation unions, probation staff on the front line to manage the situation. I'm very conscious we don't want to take pressure out of the prisons and just leave it with the probation service. Instead, this is a whole system response, and the whole system needs to be stabilised and able to face the pressures that we see within it. Just on the prison population, make no mistake, the number of prison places will increase in this country. We will deliver on the 14,000 that the previous government did not, and the prison population will therefore rise. But as I've said, we cannot build our way out of this crisis. We do have to do things differently. We are a very, very long way away from any of the changes that the Chair of the Select Committee might want to see, but fundamentally we must make sure, and the review must make sure, that we never ever run out of prison places in this country again.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Josh Babarinde.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of her statement. Now, having grown up in a home of domestic violence myself at the hands of my mum's former partner, I share the concerns of the Victims Commissioner and survivors of domestic abuse that loopholes in the early release scheme's criteria could mean that some of their abusers who are convicted of violent offences but not of domestic violence specific offences may have been released early today. I know she attempted to provide some reassurances, but I can say to her that I've received communications from affected people outside of this chamber who are not satisfied with those yet. Domestic abuse survivors deserve to be safe. Can the Secretary of State address these concerns today? On the sentencing review, we welcome the government's determination to fix the mess that the Conservatives made of our criminal justice system through the evidence-led independent sentencing review. The former Lord Chancellor, who is chairing it, and I have a track record of fixing things together. In my past life, I used to run a social enterprise phone repair company staffed by ex-offenders, and we ran pop-up repair shops in the MOJ at which the then Lord Chancellor David Gauke eagerly presented his phone for repair. So I hope that this Lord Chancellor shares that collaborative fixing spirit when it comes to engaging with the Liberal Democrats and me on this review, and I'll happily sort her out with a phone repair if she needs one. Now, while empirical evidence will be critical to this review, some of the most valuable insights on this matter are held by victims and survivors themselves. And I was therefore disappointed, although I heard it in her speech, disappointed to not find the words victim or survivor anywhere mentioned once in the terms of reference. So will the Secretary of State put that right and outline specifically how victims and survivors will be represented and formally consulted within this sentencing review? Finally, something else that was missing from the review, even though she said that there would be no constraints, no constrictions, is the injustice of indeterminate imprisonment for public protection, IPP sentences, under which almost 3,000 people remain imprisoned with no release date. And what's more is that there are people serving IPP sentences who have committed lesser offences than those being released today under the government's early release scheme. Reforming these sentences can help address prison overcrowding and the safety crisis too. Why then has the government explicitly excluded IPP sentences from this review, and will she reconsider that decision?
Lord Chancellor.
Thank you very much. I thank the Liberal Democrat spokesperson for his questions. Sorry to hear about his personal experiences, but of course they will inform the valuable contributions that he makes in this House from his own lived experience. Let me just say to him on the issue of domestic abuse, there isn't, as he knows, a specific offence of domestic abuse within our legislative framework. In order to bring in the emergency release to prevent us running out of prison spaces in July, I have pulled every lever at my disposal. You can only make these changes in law by excluding offences, not offender cohorts or offender types. That's why that list of offences that are included includes offences that are most closely connected to domestic abuse situations. But of course it is not fully comprehensive. It cannot be, because you can only exclude offences, not offender types. I hope you will recognise that in pulling this lever as early as possible in the Parliament, almost as soon as I walked into the Justice Department. I sought to do that because I wanted to give the probation service the time to prepare for this change, specifically so that they could notify victims, work on proper release plans for these offenders, make sure that those licence conditions are the right ones, and make sure that the monitoring of these offenders in the community is as strong as it needs to be. He will also know that those who are flagged as having a domestic violence background are prioritised for tags as well. Every choice I've made in bringing forward these emergency release changes has been done to try and minimise the impact on victims. I really empathise and am very affected by the concerns of victims that the offenders that have offended against them are being released some weeks or months early. That might sound small, but I know it has a huge impact. I don't seek to minimise that in any way. As I say, I pulled every lever at my disposal to try and minimise those concerns. On the sentencing review, I mean, look, when we reveal the whole panel, as I've said earlier on today, we will make sure that victims' voices are also represented. That's very important. I guess in the terms of reference, what we're trying to capture is that all of society suffers collectively when we don't get the rates of reoffending down, and this is a strategy for cutting crime, producing fewer victims in the future, and I hope he will support that. And on IPPs, look, they are specifically excluded, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is a challenging cohort of prisoners within our system. I am determined, where it's safe to do so, to make progress on releasing those who are currently serving an IPP sentence. I worked with the previous government and supported the changes to the licence terms and conditions that were brought in by the last Conservative administration. We are implementing those changes that were made in the Victims and Prisoners Act, which passed just before the general election. But what we cannot do is release people who still pose a risk to the public. What I cannot do for this cohort of offenders is release those who are still a danger to themselves and to others. So getting that balance right is incredibly important. It's not appropriate to then put this cohort of offenders within the sentencing review. I hope he'll acknowledge that.
Andrew Lewin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Under the party opposite, people who served short-term custodial sentences, more than 1 in 2 went on to reoffend. In total, reoffending is costing our country £20 billion a year. It is not working at all and is not working for our taxpayer. In my constituency of Welwyn, Hatfield and across Hertfordshire, fantastic charities such as Hat Crow are running innovative and pioneering programmes working with ex-offenders to make sure that they don't offend again in the future. Could my right honourable friend say a little bit more about how this government is going to adopt a new approach and work with charities and broader civil society to cut reoffending for good?
Lord Chancellor.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. Reoffending has a huge cost to all of us as a country because it creates more victims of crime. Also, it costs us, in fact, it's over 20 billion. It's about £22 billion a year. Charities and other groups, I think, have a huge role to play in helping us bring down the reoffending rate. In order to allow that work to succeed, we do have to bring down the overcrowding and the capacity crisis that we have in our prisons. I hope the sentencing review is able to help us chart a new course when it comes to succeeding in bringing down reoffending.
Sir Ashley Fox.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Lord Chancellor for her statement. In the first wave of early releases, 37 prisoners were wrongly released. Could she explain to the House what steps she's taking to ensure those mistakes are not repeated? And on the subject of reducing reoffending, would she agree with me that the best way of reducing reoffending is to ensure that released prisoners are able to participate in the labour market? So could she explain to the House what she will be doing to improve education and training within the prison system?
Lord Chancellor.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the 37 that were wrongly released, I have to say I had never imagined it would be possible for people to be charged and sentenced against an older Act of Parliament and not the more recent Act of Parliament, which was the 2020 legislation. As soon as that issue was brought to our attention, we took immediate steps. All 37 were ultimately returned to custody, and I will make sure that mistake cannot happen again. And on reducing reoffending, look, he makes a good point. The access to literacy training, skills, the ability to get a job is really important in helping an offender turn their back on a life of crime. I hope the sentencing review will make some positive further suggestions in this space. We know that we have to tackle reoffending. We know that jobs, housing, all of that is part of this picture if we're going to persuade people to become the better citizens we need them to be, rather than the better criminals that our system currently produces.
Bambos Sharalambos.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the Secretary of State's review of sentencing, but as she may know, the number of prisoners who are neurodivergent is hugely overrepresented in the prison population. So can she tell me what steps that she'll be taking to make sure that prisoners with ADHD and autism do not reoffend?
Lord Chancellor.
My honourable friend is clearly right that ultimately the support that prisoners receive in prison needs to be tailored to take account of needs such as neurodivergence and autism, much of which has gone undiagnosed in the life of prisoners and in fact often doesn't even get diagnosed within the prison estate. We obviously do have to turn that around. I'm confident that we can make progress in this area. Of course, firstly, we do have to deal with the capacity crisis, because when you're very, very overcrowded, you are ultimately in a position where offenders are locked up for 23 hours a day, and in that one remaining hour, very little other good work can be done. So we do have to deal with the capacity problems so that we can then deal with the underlying issues that prisoners face before they can make the positive choices that we all want them to.
Dr. Kieran Mullen.
Speaker, can I say I think the Minister's identified a good set of principles for her review. A couple of points. On the Texan approach, did you think it would be fairer to victims, rather than looking at further extending early release, that instead we use the reward around the existing access to early release? And on evidence, she talked a lot about evidence. The Minister will understand it's harder to evidence people's feelings around justice, not as individual victims in society as a whole, and that risks, therefore, statistics around reoffending and other things the Ministry has to hand, carrying a greater weight. How does she propose to close the gap around evidence when it comes to how victims and their families feel about sentencing?
Lord Chancellor.
The Honourable Member makes good points. On the Texan approach, I think this is an approach of interest because what the Texan model sought to do was incentivise the positive behaviour that reduces reoffending and cuts down ultimately on crime, and they saw some pretty spectacular results. Now, there isn't an exact read across from that model to our system. It will be for the review to consider that model and others around the world to see what approaches might work for us here. It is absolutely imperative that any measures we take retain the confidence of victims and also the wider public. In the end, every community in our country needs to believe that any punishment that takes place outside a prison still looks and feels like proper punishment, and that is non-negotiable. Public confidence must be maintained, and that speaks to his second point. The evidence is important. Actually, when victims are engaged in the process, they also, in my experience, appreciate the need for reducing reoffending. They don't want other people to be victims in the future like they have been, but their voice will be heard in this review, and I hope that that will assure the member.
Jake Richards.
Grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker. In June 2019, David Gauke made a speech when he was Lord Chancellor called Smarter Sentencing, and it was a very helpful, coherent, cogent, evidence-based speech about sentencing reform. 4 Conservative Prime Ministers later, and no progress was made. So I'm really pleased that this Labour government will grasp the nettle on this issue. Can I ask the Secretary of State about FDAC courts? So we were just discussing the Texan examples about problem-solving sentencing. Can the Lord Chancellor reassure me that this review will also look at the FDAC courts and progress and really positive results that we've seen in the family courts there?
Chancellor.
I thank my honourable friend for his question. He makes the case very well for why David Gauke is the right person to lead this review, and as I said in my remarks earlier, he does bring deep expertise to this debate, and I'm sure the review will be interested, as many are, on some of the pilots that are being run on problem-solving courts and also in the family court as well. That will, I know, already be of interest to the sentencing review panel.
Tessa Munns.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Deputy Speaker. I wonder what measures the Lord Chancellor is taking to ensure that the review considers the impact of sentencing policies on different socio-economic groups and to address concerns about disproportionate sentencing for marginalised communities and minority groups.
Chancellor.
I thank the honourable member for her question. She raises an important point. It's not actually within the terms of reference for the review, which won't be considering disparities in sentencing, because it's looking at the overall sentencing framework and how we make sure we never run out of prison places again. There is an important debate about disparities within the criminal justice system. The review on sentencing is not the proper place for that. That is other work that we will take forward in due course.
John MacDonald.
I declare an interest. I'm the Honorary Life President of the Prison Officers Association. So can I thank her on behalf of the POA for the open door policy that she's had with engagement with the union itself? And can I congratulate her on bringing forward the sentence review? The POA has long argued that there are too many people in prison with mental health problems in particular, often veterans with PSTD, who shouldn't be there but should be treated elsewhere. So could I ask her that to ensure that the unions are fully involved in the composition of the panels and in the engagement process as a part of this review?
Thank my honourable friend for his question. Working closely with our trade unions is very important to us. We've already engaged with the Prison Officers Association. Let me take this opportunity actually to place on record my thanks to all who work in our prisons and our probation system. In our prisons in particular, the rates of violence against prison officers have been too high for too long, I really salute the hard work that prison officers do on behalf of us all in what is a very difficult job. He can be assured of our close engagement with everybody who works within the prisons and probation services going forward.
James Wilde.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Parliament legislated for a maximum sentence for causing death by dangerous driving of life imprisonment, but judges are yet to impose such a sentence despite cases including my constituency where 3 people were killed by a driver in a case with 5 aggravating factors. So will the Lord Chancellor ensure that this review, as it considers longer custodial sentences, looks at how victims can get justice and how the maximum sentences passed by this place are actually put into force?
Chancellor.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the member opposite will know that sentencing decisions in individual cases are a matter for the independent judiciary, who have to consider all of the facts available in front of them and sentence accordingly based on the law and the sentencing guidelines and framework. And I cannot comment on the specifics of that case. The review won't be constrained in any way in terms of its own inquiry and review of either maximum sentences, whole life orders, the whole range of sentences that are available are open for the review panel to consider and make recommendations on.
Calvin Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for her handling of the issue and the approach she has taken in response to the challenges that she faces. This morning I met with the local police leadership about the challenges around drug-based criminality in Leighton and Wanstead. The situation they are facing couldn't be clearer. After 14 years of Tory failure, overstretched police services, overcapacity prisons, woefully underfunded probation services and councils have led to a vicious cycle of reoffending. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that the whole system needs reform and reinvestment to restore public trust in our justice system and keep my constituents safe?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. He will know that as part of our Safer Streets mission, improving confidence in the criminal justice system is one of the key outcomes that we are focused on. So he is right to make the point that the whole of the criminal justice system requires stabilisation and all of it needs to be put on a better trajectory than what we have inherited from the previous government. Of course, we're talking in detail about prisons, but it's very difficult to divorce what's happening in our prison system from what's going on in probation and what's happening in the courts as well. And just want to reassure him I do conceive of this as a whole system approach, and I'm very aware of the challenges that exist in other bits of the system, and they are things that this government will ultimately sort out.
Sir Julian Lewis.
The Lord Chancellor speaks with great clarity and determination on this issue, and I'm sure she'll remember last week promising me a ministerial meeting involving my constituent Andrew Duncan and a specialist team that is working on a new concept of community detention that I believe is tailor-made for the vision that she's outlined to us today. So can she just confirm that that meeting will go ahead, notwithstanding the extra opportunity to give evidence to the Gork review in due course?
I thank the honourable member for his intervention. I knew immediately he was going to ask about the meeting that he referenced last week when I made my other statement. I can assure him that I will follow that up, and I'm interested in the work of the group that he references, and I'm sure the Sentencing Review Panel will also be interested in that work.
Charlotte Nichols.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Lord Chancellor for her statement and for the leadership that she's shown in trying to turn around a department that by any metric was failing, and for the transparent and considered approach she's taken in reaching some of the very difficult decisions she's had to since taking office. On the early release scheme, while accepting its inevitability, I wanted to ask her what conversations she's had with ministerial colleagues with regards to improving victim support for those who have seen perpetrators return to the community earlier than they were perhaps mentally prepared for, to reduce harm as far as possible.
Thank my honourable friend for her question. I can assure her I've been working closely, and my ministerial team have been working very closely with our colleagues, primarily in the Home Office, but also across government. The support for victims sits across different government departments, but we are making sure that we have a one-team approach to this important matter. I have sought to pull the levers I had at my disposal in such a way that we were able to give the probation service the time they needed to prepare for the SDS 40 changes. I wanted to do that because I wanted to make sure that our obligations under the victim notification scheme could be met. I am obviously chasing progress and monitoring progress on this very regularly, and I will ensure that any improvements that are required are made on a continual basis, that this is something that we keep under constant review.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Cyfarwydd. Neil Foden is in prison for the sexual abuse of 4 vulnerable school children. He was the head teacher and strategic head teacher at 2 secondary schools in Gwynedd. Foden was convicted of 19 charges and sentenced to 17 years in July this year for his abhorrent crimes. The judge said he showed no remorse. Can she advise me how to seek assurance for his victims that Foden won't be released until he's served at least 2/3 of his sentence?
I can confirm all sex offences of all types are excluded from the SDS 40 measures.
Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I very much welcome the Lord Chancellor's sentencing review, but on immediate systemic issues, privately run Forest Bank Prison in Salford is at 138% capacity, with continued reports over the years of high levels of violence and insufficient rehabilitative training for prisoners. The contract runs out in January, so can the Secretary confirm who will be running the prison after this date? Will she be bringing it back under state control? And what measures she is taking now to urgently ensure safety within the prison and adequate rehabilitative training provision?
Thank my honourable friend for her question. I won't preempt any future decisions now about any particular prison. Let me just say I'm not ideological really about whether a prison is run by the state or privately run. There are some good prisons in both types of that sector, whether state or private, and there are prisons that are failing in the state sector as well as in the private sector. The most important thing is we have to get on top of the capacity crisis that exists across the whole of the prison estate in the country. We have to reduce overcrowding so that we can focus on the good quality rehabilitation activity that I know governors in every type of prison want to ensure happens in their prisons, so that prisoners can be helped to turn their lives around.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Can I congratulate her on recognising that for some prisoners, the shortcomings of short sentences are properly remedied by longer ones. But on the review, David Gauke, it's difficult not to like him and even admire him, but I'm not alone in regarding him as a notorious wet, am I?
Well, I shall leave those characterisations to the internal workings of the Conservative Party. I consider David Gauke to be a person with deep expertise in this area. He's a former Lord Chancellor. He knows this territory very well. He'll be able to hit the ground running, and I know he will go where the evidence takes him.
Mike Amesbury.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Lord Chancellor referred to some of the successful work in Texas. If we adopt such a model over here, how will victims be involved in shaping that tough rehabilitation approach?
I thank my honourable friend. We'll make sure that the review panel, when it's all fully put together, does include somebody with experience of working with victims of crime to make sure that that perspective is fully reflected in the investigations that the review will undertake and ultimately in the findings and the recommendations that they make.
Paul Kohler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I congratulate the Lord Chancellor on the terms of reference of this review and the appointment of the excellent David Gauke. I remain, however, concerned about your evident enthusiasm for increasing capacity. So can I ask the Lord Chancellor directly, do you agree with your colleague in the other place? We imprison too many people in this country, and is the Lord Chancellor's ultimate aim to reduce the prison population?
I think we need to make sure that we have the prison places that we need to lock up those people who have to be locked up. That is fundamentally non-negotiable. And we have to see the increase in prison capacity, the 14,000 as I referenced earlier in my remarks that the previous government failed to deliver, because without them we will run out of prison places again. So we have to build on the supply, and then we also have to make sure that there are prison places for those that have to be locked up and do better on reoffending. All of these things are important, equally important. They all have to be done at the same time. I'm not going to set arbitrary figures about how many can and should go to prison. What I want to make sure is we have a prison system whereby we never run out of prison places ever again, and we do better on rehabilitation, and we expand punishment outside of prison.
Alex Barris-Curtis.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome the announcement of this bipartisan sentencing review panel, and I thank my right honourable friend for her continuing work to fix the mess of the last 14 years in this department. On the question of reoffending, the evidence shows that 55% of adults on short sentences are going on to reoffend, but meanwhile community orders have a 34% reoffending rate. So can she assure me that this is something that the panel will look at and consider as part of its remit?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. This is exactly the sort of area that I know that the panel will be reviewing. And I would just say also, although the reoffending rates for community orders are lower, they're still far too high, and I'm sure the sentencing panel is going to want to consider how to bring all of these numbers down so that we can make sure we're rehabilitating more people and ultimately cutting crime.
Dr Becky Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In 2021, the Justice Select Committee highlighted the fact that too many offenders are imprisoned because community orders with mental health requirements were unavailable in many areas across the country. Does the Lord Chancellor agree that we must now work across the health and justice systems to make sure adequate provision is available in this essential area?
She's absolutely right, and I can assure her I will be working closely with the Secretary of State for Health to make sure that there is join up across government in making sure we do everything we can to reduce reoffending, rehabilitate more people and ultimately cut crime.
Jonathan Brash.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome a statement today from the Secretary of State, and in particular her preference for deportation of foreign criminals, and also her comments that actually for hyper-prolific offenders, a particular problem in my constituency, longer sentences may be the best thing. Can she commit, though, whatever the outcome of this review, that dangerous criminals that pose a threat to the public in Hartlepool and anywhere else will always be locked up under this government?
Yes, I absolutely can. The whole point of doing this review is to make sure this country is never again in a position where we might run out of prison places, and those who must be locked up to keep the public safe will always be locked up.
Warren Just.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Keeping a prisoner in prison costs the taxpayer over £50,000 a year, whereas punishing the prisoner out of prison costs less than £5,000 a year. And what is more, Madam Deputy Speaker, the prisoner is then far less likely to reoffend. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that the taxpayers' money would be better spent on having a much cheaper and better alternative to prison?
My honourable friend makes a really important point on the relative costs of imprisonment against punishment outside of prison. What I would say to him is, in delivering the prison places, the 14,000 that the previous government failed to deliver, that is a big cost, but it is a cost that will be met by this government. And we also have to make sure that we expand punishment outside of prison. All of these options have to be pursued if we're going to get to grips with this crisis.
John Slinger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. While I'm not given to hyperbole, I would simply say that my right honourable friend has inherited a shocking and dangerous situation, and she's dealing with it in a calm and collected manner. Yeah. I applaud and support the move to a more sensible policy around sentencing and a more sustainable policy. Would my right honourable friend agree with me, though, that my constituents in Rugby will be assured that we will always lock up violent and dangerous offenders where necessary to keep the public safe?
Honourable friend, and let me assure him the answer to his question is yes and yes. Part of the reason for doing this review is to make sure this country never again is on the brink of running out of prison places, and dangerous offenders who need to be locked up to keep the public safe will always be locked up.
Lauren Edwards.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I really welcome this sentencing review, and I thank the Secretary of State for her explanation as to why IPP sentences are not being included in this review. But will she now also consider what steps she can take to accelerate routes out of custody for prisoners serving IPP sentences, including a resentencing review which can be done without prejudice to public protection, and end an injustice once and for all, and increase capacity in our prison estate?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I hear the point that my honourable friend makes. She makes it very well. Let me just say we are not considering a resentencing exercise for IPP prisoners, because that would automatically release a number of people who we do not believe would be safe to release, and I'm not willing to compromise public protection. I know that there is a huge injustice at the heart of these issues, and the IPP sentences have rightly been abolished, but we do have this problem with the cohort, particularly of those under an IPP sentence who have never been released at all. I am determined to make more progress wherever it is possible to do so safely, to release more IPP prisoners, but never in a way that compromises public protection.
Amanda Martin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Secretary of State's commitment to cross-party working, to transparency, and that commitment to rebuild public trust. Does she agree with me that this is a significant departure from the previous government, as they released over 10,000 prisoners, not in the open, but in secret?
And without exemption. I do agree with my honourable friend. She is right to remind the House of the last Conservative government's end of custody supervised licence scheme, for which we in the end had to release the numbers. Over 10,000 offenders were released under that scheme without transparency and without the same exemptions that we have applied to the SDS 40 changes.
Sean Davies.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. What a mess we've inherited. I want to thank the Lord Chancellor for taking the steps that she's taken today to sort it out. We know that offenders who are subject to home detention orders are 50% less likely to reoffend, but can we put them to work as well during unpaid work sessions, Madam Deputy Speaker? And those offenders who commit further offences whilst on licence, can we ensure that they are dealt with more robustly in the courts as they are recalled to prison?
My honourable friend raises really important points about how we break the cycle of recalls to prison and ensure that licence conditions are abided by, and also the scope for putting more offenders to work. I'm sure these will be matters of great interest to the Sentencing Review Panel, and I look forward to seeing their findings in due course.
Ben Goldsborough.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The last 14 years have shown that governments ignore the prison estate at their peril. My honourable friend rightly says that we must redesign punishment outside of the secure estate. Can she elaborate how offenders will have their liberty curtailed and how the public will be made aware of this liberty being taken away?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. I think fundamentally the modern world with different technology presents the best possible opportunity for us to expand the use of punishment outside of prison, but in a way where the public can have confidence that offenders are being supervised, that the eyes of the state remain upon those people, and that their behaviour and their liberty is effectively curtailed. I expect that new technology as well as current available technology will be of great interest to the review panel, and I do look forward to their findings when they report in the spring.
We now come to the end of the statement, and we come to the